LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is James Penner, who joins us to discuss his book, Timothy Leary, The Harvard Years. On May 27, 1963, Dr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert were dismissed from Harvard University's Psychology Department, a watershed event marking the moment when psychedelic drugs were publicly demonized and driven underground. Today, little is known about the period in the early 1960s when LSD and psilocybin were not only legal but also actively researched at universities. Presenting the first collection of Leary's writings devoted entirely to the research phase of his career, 1960 to 65, Timothy Leary, The Harvard Years, offers rare articles from Leary's time as a professor in Harvard's Psychology Department, including writings from the Harvard Psilocybin Project, the Concord Prison Project, and the Good Friday Experiment. These essays, co-authored with Richard Alpert, Houston Smith, Ralph Metzner, and other psychedelic research visionaries, explore the nature of creativity and the therapeutic, spiritual, and religious aspects of psilocybin and LSD. Featuring Leary's scientific articles and a rare account of his therapeutic approach on existential transaction theory, the book also includes Leary's final essay from his time at Harvard, The Politics of Consciousness, as well as controversial articles published shortly after his dismissal. This collection of seminal early writings by Leary shows why he quickly became an articulate spokesperson for consciousness expansion and an iconic figure for the counterculture generation that came of age in the 1960s. Hello and welcome, James, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Today, James, we're going to talk about your new book, which is entitled Timothy Leary, The Harvard Years. Subtitle on that is Early Writings on LSD and Psilocybin, and that's with various people that Timothy Leary worked with over the years. Before we dive into all of that, tell listeners a little bit about your background and what your interest is in Timothy Leary's life and work and generally in psychedelics.
Yeah, well, basically, maybe it's a little odd because I'm a literary critic and I'm a professor in an English department. And when I was writing my first book, which is actually about gender studies, and it's called Pinks, Punks, and Pansies, the Rhetoric of Masculinity in American Literary Culture. When I was writing that book, I did about 10 pages on Timothy Leary and the 1960s. And he was obviously tremendously influential on the counterculture, and so that's when I first really read him seriously, and I became really fascinated with his early writings, particularly the period between 60 and 65 when he was a professor. And when he gets fired in 63, in May of 63, the period right after that, where he's still publishing in scholarly journals for about 2 years. So it's basically 60 to 65, and I became very, very fascinated with his work. And so I'm kind of coming to psychedelics from, I guess, a kind of an unconventional route.
Yeah, well, perhaps for the benefit of listeners who don't know who Timothy Leary is, because he obviously was a very public and influential figure at one time, and you kind of have to be nudging up against certain areas of culture really to discover him these days. Now, perhaps just in a nutshell, tell people about his career. I mean, obviously we're going to talk about the early stages of it here, but just to fill people in.
Yeah, I mean, he's an extremely influential figure. He's an icon of the 60s. And basically, he begins as a Harvard professor, as a psychologist, And he's a kind of rising star in psychology in the late 50s. And in 1960, he discovers magic mushrooms, and in Cuernavaca, in his famous epiphany in Cuernavaca, and he becomes very interested in using them in psychology and in therapy and in a number of uses, and this eventually becomes very controversial. Because he's fired from Harvard in 1963, and then the fact that he gets fired only increases his popularity, especially with young people, especially with the counterculture, and he becomes, by about 65, 66, he's a huge iconic figure, and he is very much in the media. As you know, being against the Vietnam War and being a kind of patron saint of the hippies and the counterculture, and eventually he becomes a dangerous figure for the establishment and in particular for the Nixon administration, who Nixon's famous for calling Leary the most dangerous man in America. A somewhat hyperbolic statement, but it there is some truth to it in the sense that Leary was considered dangerous to the Nixon administration and with his power over the counterculture, and so in the 60s he's a key figure. He eventually goes to prison in 1970 for a very small possession of marijuana, less than an ounce, really about 2 roach clips that were found in his ashtray in his car, and that they really wanted to make an example out of him and gave him 30 years in prison for that incident, and that's when he goes to initially a low security prison, the sort of nice prisons where you can go to the library and read books and things like that. However, eventually he escapes from prison, from the low security prison in 1970, goes into exile in Europe, and that's when he gets in big trouble with eventually with the government and the State Department, and the Drug Enforcement Agency eventually catches him in 63, I believe it's 73. And then he's placed in a maximum security prison where he spends 3 years and eventually gets out in, I believe, 1976. And so when he gets out of prison, he's not as powerful as he was in the 1960s. In terms of his popularity, he remains, known by the counterculture, but he never really, I think he wants to kind of stay out of trouble as well because he spent 3 years in prison. And so he kind of, I don't want to say he keeps a low profile, but definitely stays away from doing anything really controversial. And basically he dies in 96. He's very prolific throughout his life. And I guess I have a particular reading of his work, and I'm more interested in his early work when he was a professor, and I'll talk more about that. So I think he's hugely important for the 1960s and for the counterculture. Since that time, maybe certainly with young people now, not everybody knows him. I know my students aren't familiar with him when I mention him in class. So, but I think he's definitely an iconic figure for anybody who grew up in the 1960s.
And of course, we should mention Turn On, Tune In, Drop Out, because that famous video clip of him, a lot of people will have heard that phrase bandied about and perhaps not known where it came from. Right.
We should mention that. That becomes a kind of catchphrase, a little mantra that people use over and over again when they talk about Leary, and it kind of represents the moment when he is interested in celebrity. I have to say that it's not an accident that he becomes hugely popular in the mid 60s, and the Tune In, Turn On, Drop Out is probably about 1966, 65 is when he starts saying that to the media, and they respond to that. And yeah, he becomes associated with that over and over again. But the problem with that phrase is it doesn't represent, it represents his philosophy at a certain point in the 1960s, but it doesn't really sum up all of his thinking. And in particularly the dropout part, he in different interviews he would talk about how it didn't necessarily mean drop out of society, that it meant drop out of the sort of cultural myths that envelop our society and have a kind of critical distance. But people interpreted it as quit your job, drop out of society, and drop out of the university, so on. So I guess there is a nuance there as well with that phrase.
Now, of course, we talked about already about the reaction of the establishment to what Leary was writing and saying, and Nixon's phrase, as you say, may well have been a bit overcooked, but there was definitely subversive potential there, and you could see how this is what's brought home, particularly reading this collection of writings that you've put together, how things could have been different if his life had taken a different course. The sort of change, maybe this is idealistic, but I was able to imagine the sort of change that could have taken place in society if some of his ideas had gone forward. But it does serve that wider purpose for the establishment, that the image of Leary to many people now, it is that video clip with him and his flowers in his hair. And I watched some later television interviews, and he didn't come across that well. He looked tired. He looked fed up with the whole thing. I mean, that's just my reading of one or two interviews I saw. So this image of him as some sort of clown and not a serious thinker. I mean, a lot of people don't even know about his work in the late 50s and early 60s. That suits a particular agenda, I think.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think that because Leary becomes so interested in doing media stunts, for example, he runs for the governor of California in 1970, and there's no way he can possibly win. He's just about ready to go to prison. And he does that as a media stunt, and people now tend to think of him only in terms of his media stunts, and they don't think of him in terms of his writing. And he's a very serious intellectual, and his writing from 1960 to 65, his scholarly work is some very serious thinking in terms of psychology, in terms of consciousness, in terms of spirituality, in terms of Eastern religions. These ideas are kind of glossed over. People aren't really familiar with the earlier intellectual version of Leary, when he was a Harvard professor and when he was a public intellectual who was mainly concerned with ideas and less about celebrity and the counterculture. And I have to say that this does suit a certain agenda in terms of dismissing Leary, and if you can dismiss his ideas without really reading him. But the other thing is that Leary is also to blame in the sense that he, at a certain point in 1966, 65, 66, I point out the Playboy interview. I think it was in the spring of 66. When he does this interview, he moves away from being a really serious scientist, and he tries to appeal to a much wider audience, and he says some very hyperbolic statements, and this made him more popular, but I also think that his writing isn't as serious, and it's just not as good as his earlier work, and so there is a sense that he's partially responsible as well, and then people, and what you say as well, that people are it is a certain agenda that people want to dismiss him as a kind of media clown or trickster. That's often how he's thought of, as a trickster who does media stunts. but they don't actually think about his ideas like they did in the earlier 60s.
Now, what you've done with this book is basically gathered together a lot of his early writings that were scattered. They were articles, presentations that he gave, the texts of. And my initial thought was, why has no one done this before? It's been such a long time ago, and this stuff is so important. And I mean, I knew that, Leary had an academic background and that then something changed, basically. But I just wasn't aware of, just what a deep thinker he was and how ahead of his time in many ways.
Yeah, it struck me as completely bizarre that his best work, his most serious work, all these articles he did while he was at Harvard and right after he was fired, were completely out of print, really hard to find, and nobody had brought them back in. Nobody had put them in a book, and people were much more willing to publish his later work, which from the 70s and 80s, which isn't nearly as good, and so I just found that really weird. And so I first off, I made a point of collecting everything there was, and that took a long time. I had to work with a librarian, and we had to kind of locate a lot of these very, very obscure articles that were published in journals that are really hard to find. They definitely weren't on the web. And once we gathered everything, I was amazed at how much material there was. And my book is 416 pages, and actually I'm looking at it right now, 382. But there was some essays that I had to even not put in because of I didn't want to have a 500-page book that was so massive that nobody would buy it. And so he was tremendously prolific in this time period of 60 to 65. A lot of the articles are co-written with other psychologists, but still his productivity is quite amazing. And also, I think people are really surprised not only at how much he wrote, but also that he wrote so much when he was taking a lot of psychedelic drugs as well, that it seemed to enhance his productivity, which is something we don't normally associate with psychedelic drugs. The stereotype is that they kind of make you unfocused and kind of out of it. And that wasn't the case at all for Leary in the early 1960s.
Well, in my experience, I mean, I was going to ask you, you can choose to answer or not, if you've taken psychedelics in the past. But in my own experience, something like cannabis, which I've known over the years, quite a few people who smoked it regularly, sometimes on a weekend, other people on a daily basis, and that I would identify as behavior that will inhibit, just work rate, getting stuff done. You're unfocused, and that is certainly in that state. Something like LSD or other psychedelics, that's not something that you can do on a daily basis unless you want to end up like Syd Barrett, basically. But that can be enhanced creativity a great deal, and a lot has been written. I've spent 25 years plus as a music journalist and often written about performers and writers using various substances, whatever it happens to be, and the tales of albums that got recorded and books that got written that never would have otherwise are legion. So there's undoubtedly something to that. It won't necessarily be the same for everybody, but I can certainly believe, it's not unbelievable to me that Leary would be productive and creative during that phase. Yeah,
absolutely. It definitely seemed to push him more than the phase in the late 1950s when he was basically just drinking alcohol. He was much more productive. He was productive in the late 50s, but I definitely think that there's this key moment when he discovers psychedelics where he becomes a huge figure, just in terms of the 1960s culture, but also in terms of his productivity. My own feeling about it is I've mainly experimented with magic mushrooms, and for me, that's something that you can not do on a regular basis. Really, my own particular technique was when I was writing my dissertation in graduate school, which was after I would finish one chapter, which would take maybe 2 or 3 months, then I would have a mushroom trip at the end of it, and I found that was a way to when I felt really burned out with the material and I was perhaps sick of writing, or maybe even bored with the material, the magic mushrooms were a way of opening up ideas and giving me a more creative way of thinking about everything, and so it was rejuvenating for me in a sort of intellectual and emotional way. And so, of course, using them in a very safe environment, in a very aesthetic environment, I think they can enhance your creativity and your productivity, but you definitely have to know how to do it. And Leary clearly did in the early days. I mean, that was part of his initial discovery was the theory of set and setting. And prior to Leary, many people would take psychedelic drugs in a very clinical environment, in a sterile hospital or mental illness facility, and it was really the worst place to do psychedelics. And he was the one that took them home and did them at his apartment in Cambridge with music, with classical music, with lights and artwork, and also he made a very comfortable environment for anybody who happened to come to Cambridge to visit him, and he kind of made a science out of how to eliminate bad trips by creating this very warm social environment in his home, and so that I think is a very key part of it. Is not to do it all the time, but also to do it in a very safe and comfortable setting. So certainly not in a nightclub, or that this is not something that Leary was interested in the early 60s at all. He was very ritualistic about doing psychedelic drugs.
I would just say, for people who aren't aware of the expression, you said set and setting. I mean, setting's obvious, but set refers to mindset.
Mindset. You have to be in a good place when you want to have the experience. And if you're feeling really depressed, then it's probably not a good idea. If you're really and also if you have a pre-existing condition as well, like schizophrenia or autism, we know that it's really not a good idea as well. And you mentioned Sid Barrett earlier, and I know that he was schizophrenic ever before he started experimenting with psychedelics, and it certainly was not a good idea for him. Although he did make some great music on psychedelics, but I think ultimately it was not healthy for him in the long run.
No, and his later music as well, after Pink Floyd took a nosedive, certainly there's been some stuff that's been dug out of the archives that's garbage compared to,
Mm-hmm. I actually like those 2 albums, solo albums. I think he's just an amazing talent. I realize it may not be as on the level of his Pink Floyd work, but his voice is so remarkable, and his lyrics and the imagery in his songs, I'm really quite impressed with almost everything he did. I guess at least those 2 solo albums. I'm
thinking of some stuff that came out sort of not unofficially, but it was dredged up from. It must have been just the last of anything that he had recorded.
I see. Yeah, I haven't heard that.
Back to Leary, he obviously had a pivotal experience of psychedelics. You mentioned the magic mushroom trip earlier, and that changed everything. And one thing that psychedelics tend to do is dissolve your sense of self, that kind of ego-centeredness. And in his work in psychology, it became very apparent to him that this could be a tool to be used to help people. And he talks about what he calls the identity game, centered around our ego and what we build our identity on and how we live. And he also talks about cultural behavior in that context. And how we're all playing these little the game of religion, and he likens it to sport, doesn't he, in one of his talks, which is a really good way of doing it. He talks about how people get penalized for not playing these identity games appropriately and not behaving in a culturally appropriate way. And we label, he mentions schizophrenics and such like. Some people have got seem to be very clearly designated mental illnesses. Other people appear just to be not playing the game. As simple as that. They just don't want to go along with the rest of society. I mean, Joseph Chilton Pearce, who I've had on here in his Cosmic Egg books, he talks about this cultural conditioning as well, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, I think that Leary was very interested in the idea of ego death, and that happens in generally at the beginning of the trip, in the most intense part. And he talks about ego death in terms of psilocybin and also in terms of LSD, and he also talks about the idea of rebirth, and this becomes a really important theme. After you experience the ego death, then you have this rebirth experience and a kind of catharsis. And for Leary, in his personal life, I'll just give you an example, that his first wife committed suicide in 1955. He found her in the garage, and he had 2 children with her, and this was obviously a traumatic experience for Leary, and he had a lot of guilt about it because her suicide there were definitely notes that she left that were designed for him to feel that he was responsible for it, and that was part of why she did it, and this was tremendously difficult for Leary, but it's when he has that epiphany in Cuernavaca in August of 1960 when he's able to kind of release himself from that guilt and the game of being responsible for her suicide, and it enables him to have a kind of rebirth and get over that very awful episode in his life, and he's able to be a productive person again and to kind of move on. And so I think that's an example of the therapeutic potential that Leary saw in psychedelic drugs. He felt it was much more effective than the existing forms of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. That in patient-centered therapy, you could have this epiphany, catharsis experience that could be life-changing, and what he called behavior change. And that he was very interested in that. And that's actually what he was looking for in his psychology. In his work in the late 1950s, he was interested in behavior change, but he didn't quite know that psychedelic drugs would be the way to enact it, that it would provide the praxis for behavior change. And so it's kind of like he found the secret that he'd been looking for several years.
Quantum physics, quantum mechanics is pointing the way to, well, has been for some time, the idea that scientists cannot be a detached observer. Thinking about Leary's methods, what he calls existential transaction theory, is really about breaking down barriers between a psychologist and a patient or subject. And as mentioned earlier, avoiding sterile sort of surroundings and getting involved with the client, if I can call it that, which is quite opposed to the stereotypical idea of a psychologist, and or a psychiatrist as well. You end up on the couch, and they have to be very detached and just observe and probe and question, but in no way can they get in any way involved. And of course, what Leary learned through his work with psychedelics is actually there was another way to do this that could deliver very different results.
Yeah, absolutely. Leary begins as a behaviorist and sort of very familiar with the psychiatrist or psychologist as a detached observer. And then in his second book, which is never actually published, but he's working on the manuscript, he comes up with existential transaction theory, which is meant to destroy and destabilize all the sort of professional hierarchies so that the patient and the psychologist become co-collaborators, that they are equals, that they spend space and time together. And Leary wanted to prefer the psychologist as a coach. He liked that idea of a coach rather than a medical authority, and that they share this experience of empathy and collaboration, and this became his revolutionary theory. And this is exactly what he did during the Concord Prison Project when he took psilocybin with the inmates in the Massachusetts Correctional Institute in 61 and 62. That becomes existential transaction in practice. And so Leary's theory, his revolutionary theory, which is very similar to ideas that R.D. Laing has at the same time, the anti-psychiatry movement in England at that time is very similar to Leary's early writings. And also Michel Foucault's first book also has similar ideas about kind of deconstructing the professional relationships. And so Leary was very interested in this, and it's a key part of his work, even though he's not a practicing psychologist anymore after he gets fired from Harvard, but it definitely influences his philosophy. And I guess this is also what's important about my book is people have completely forgotten this period in his thinking.
Well, I always liked the little quip, I never met a psychiatrist who didn't need one.
Leary would like that as well. He would like that.
I knew a psychologist once, and he was completely screwed up. But, well, you mentioned the Concord prison experiment, and that's one of the big projects that Leary undertook to, try and advance his ideas. Worth reminding ourselves here, of course, that we're talking about here a time, it seems almost unbelievable now, when LSD and other similar substances were legal. There was no problem there. The trouble really started in many ways, sort of, with Leary in that sense. But there was the first Harvard Psychedelics project. And I have to say, I had heard about it, but reading in your book, I was quite impressed by the list of participants. A lot of very well-known and eminent people. I mean, albeit coming from somewhat of a counterculture background. Yeah.
The Harvard Psilocybin Project was very interested in the sense of working with writers and intellectuals and jazz musicians, and the idea was that psychedelic drugs could, expand not only your consciousness but make you more creative. And Aldous Huxley was one of the first participants. He was very close with Leary at this time because he was actually teaching at MIT. And then you also have Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky, the various beat poets who participate. And then also Arthur Koestler, the novelist of Darkness at Noon. He's a participant, although he's not too keen on psychedelics, but he does participate in the project. He has a bad trip, and Leary thinks that it's based on the fact that he was a prisoner of war, and that comes out when he takes psychedelic drugs. But also jazz musicians as well, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Mingus, and John Coltrane, and they are also participating in Leary's early work, and I think he has a tremendous kind of cultural impact in the early 60s. Now, the thing is that Leary moves away from this when he does the Concord Prison Project. He moves. The problem that emerges with the Creativity Project is that there's no way to empirically prove that it makes you more creative. these artists and writers write these reports and they claim that, but there isn't a statistical way really to measure it. And so that's why, it's part of the reason why Leary becomes very interested in the Concord Prison Project, because this is, if he can prove that the prisoners are reformed and that they don't return to prison, that is something that is possible to prove, and that explains his shift towards the Concord Prison Project in 61.
Well, it makes more sense, really, because we don't really need to encourage jazz musicians any more than they are already. And but you know, you would think that the describing the Concord prison experiment sounds like a recipe for disaster. You know, to go in a prison environment, and albeit it was highly controlled and well planned, but to administer psychedelics to prisoners, I'm not sure what sort of crimes. With a range of felons in there, from misdemeanors through to murder. I'm not sure. Maybe you can throw some light on that. But the results are remarkable, and I think it's quite touching actually to read some of the reactions that prisoners had, and just about how they just see the world in a different way, and they know that they don't have to play the criminal game anymore unless they choose to.
Yeah, it's an amazing experiment, and it's very idealistic, but this is, I think, the kind of controversial part of Leary, is that he's willing to get in the trenches, and that he's not a detached observer. He's willing to take psilocybin with embezzlers and I'm not sure if they're murderers, but they're felons and serious criminals, and he's able to have a lot of success in the sense that they have this kind of catharsis and breakthrough experience, and I think initially he had a lot of success. The problem was that he gets fired from Harvard in 63, so he's not really able to do the follow-up work with the prisoners, because this is really a study that you need to not only look at 1 year or 2 year or 3 years, but you really need to look at 10 years later. And Leary no longer had the resources to do that, so it kind of had to stop. But I think it's a really interesting moment. Also, when you consider it 61, 62 as well, this is the very idealistic side of the 1960s that's happening, before the Summer of Love and before the late 60s. And so I think that's also what's kind of interesting about it.
And of course, later on, I was too young to remember the 60s. Later on, reading accounts of the time and newsreels and the rest of it, coverage, even before these drugs were made illegal, or while they were being made illegal, and afterwards, the coverage tended to be sensationalist. They would write about a girl takes acid and jumps off a 10-story building, sort of thing, thinks she can fly, that sort of stuff, and it was really scaring people who were unfamiliar with it away from any in this area at all. That the idea there could be any good could come with this was next.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of my book is about, people have completely forgotten about the period when psychedelics were legal. And this period of the late 50s to 1966 is when they become illegal in the U.S. People forget about it completely, and they automatically think of the Summer of Love and the late 60s and the idea of kind of psychedelic drugs being associated with decadence and with kind of going too far. And also what you said with jumping out of 5-story windows, and walking into moving traffic, and these sensationalist stories emerge, and that becomes eventually, historically, I think that's how a lot of people think about psychedelic drugs. That's their image is basically Woodstock or the sensationalist media accounts, and they completely forget about the earlier period when they were part of the university, when they were part of the human potential movement, with and Leary's work at Harvard, these social experiments. That this is been completely lost. And so I think what can be very useful is to revisit this earlier period, to kind of reconceptualize psychedelics and to think of them in a new way. Because I think in a lot of cases we tend to look at them with the use and abuse paradigm that you might use for heroin or cocaine. You might think of use and abuse, but that doesn't really work for psychedelics because psychedelics aren't addictive, and they leave your system within after 12 hours. They're completely out of your system, and so the use and abuse and addiction paradigm isn't really relevant. Yet that's how a lot of people tend to think about them, and that's unfortunate, and I guess that's what what people are trying to change right now in terms of the psychedelic renaissance that's happening in medicine and therapy right now, and with the movement to legalize psychedelics, is trying to get away from those myths and sensationalist stories that really date back to the late 1960s.
Yeah, because you had, most people, as you say, think of Summer of Love. They just think of something foolish and idealistic at best that went wrong. They'll think about Altamont rather than Woodstock, and they'll think about Charles Manson and Hell's Angels and all the rest of it. But never mind the fact that Leary's research and where that could have led was set aside for so long. Not even thinking about these sort of substances as recreational, which you would have to admit that even heroin starts out as being recreational for people. There was something sacred in this. I don't use that word lightly, and I think Leary recognized this, that there was something. Yes, he would like to steer it in a direction to help people and by extension help everyone, but there was something special here, and there was an element of because there's a Good Friday experiment which was conducted as well, and there's something that most people report when they try psychedelics, something spiritual about the experience.
Yeah. Leary was very interested in this spiritual reaction because he was not a spiritual person in any way. He was a staunch critic of Roman Catholicism, at least the Roman Catholicism of his childhood and his mother's Roman Catholicism, and he was an atheist and very much a scientist. Yet he starts having these spiritual experiences when he takes psychedelic drugs, and he never stops being a scientist, but he realizes that there is this mystical tradition in the West, and that they know how to write about. They have a vocabulary for the visionary experience that doesn't exist in science. I mean, what can science say about an epiphany or a moment of illumination? Not too much. I mean, it tends to discourage using sort of hyperbolic language, right? There's a tendency in science to stay away from that, and that we only need to deal with empirical proof. And so Leary becomes very interested in this mystical tradition in the Good Friday experiment. And he seems to be the last person that would have a spiritual experience, but he does, and he really embraces it and goes on to write a book about the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he becomes very interested in Tibetan Buddhism and Eastern thought in general. And so he's able to think about things from two perspectives at the same time. He remains a scientist, but he also is very open to the visionary and spiritual experience and the mystical experience. And these become different ways of thinking about the psychedelic experience. And in his work, I think he doesn't feel that you have to be one or the other. He tries to reject a kind of either or thinking. And he's very interested in kind of deconstructing any one monolithic way of thinking about something. And he likes to embrace multiple ways of thinking about the same experience.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really important, particularly given how much sort of monolithic thinking there has been since Leary's day and some of the problems that we face globally, which are generally speaking getting worse. The idea of spiritual science should not be dismissed at all, and it's why I have a problem with a lot of modern mainstream science, is because it believes it can be thoroughly objective, and that science itself is the only way of learning anything about reality or the world, and it denies meaning, the importance of meaning, and it denies the scientists will quite often even go so far as to deny their own subjective experience. Sort of they'll write books to say I'm not having an experience or whatever. So why need you to tell us about it then?
There's the famous joke about there's two behaviorists and they have sex together, and then the one behaviorist says to the other, "Well, it was good for you. Was it good for me? Does that mean it was good for me?"
Quite. Well, I mean, we have this habit. It is science. I don't want to be overly critical of science here. It's incredibly important, very useful. It's brought us a lot of advances and it's taught us a lot. So let's just get that one out of the way. But we generally have a tendency, particularly in the West, to try and break down everything and to label it, categorize it, and then we wonder why we struggle to relate and reintegrate all these pieces again. Just like smashing your Rococo vase and then wondering why it doesn't look as good when you glue it back together.
Yeah, I think Leary was fascinated with kind of deconstructing not only behaviorism, but the sort of rational consciousness that people assume is the only form of truth, and that he becomes very interested in deconstructing that what he called the science game is what he calls it at a certain point, and I think this is what makes his writing so interesting. I mean, if he had remained just a materialist, a hardcore materialist and scientist, I don't think his writing would have been as interesting as it was, as he was able to look at things from so many different perspectives, and this is what I think makes his work so salient now, is the multiplicity that he has in his work. Well,
my last guest actually on last week used to work at CERN, the big research project there, the Hadron Collider, all that, and he ended up quitting eventually because he basically said, "I can't do this anymore. This is not holistic thinking. We're almost like trying to find God, in all these little, we're firing these little things around in this, the biggest machine ever constructed by humanity." He said, "This is not the way to discover meaning or purpose or the nature of reality." So that was interesting to talk to him, and from that perspective, he was just looking for more a unified way of looking at the world. As you said a moment ago, multiple ways of thinking about the same thing.
Yeah. I think Leary is ahead of his time in this way. I mean, I think he's one of the earliest postmodernists who really believes, the idea that everything is a kind of cultural game. And you can play the game well, or you can give up the game. And he plays this very seriously in terms of his life. And I think it's part of why he ends up in prison is he's kind of playing the game of the intellectual and the kind of Socrates figure. And he eventually ends up in prison, really, I think, decides that maybe he doesn't want to play the Socrates game anymore, and I think he has a hard time while he's in prison. So prison is a pretty strong social construction that's very hard to deconstruct and dismantle when you're actually in prison. And I think that becomes a problem for him. And that's sort of I guess what I'm getting at is that's a sort of logical endpoint of being this kind of radical postmodernist and radical social constructionist, that he ends up having to kind of move away from that at a certain point in the 70s.
I've often had this thought that if you withdraw from all the games and you don't play, you will end up in prison or dead.
That's certainly the case with Leary.
Well, he has this great phrase. In the book, you've written an introduction, your thoughts on each of the pieces. So forgive me if I'm attributing this phrase to Leary and not you, but in the book, a phrase I loved was it talks about the great game that no one wins or loses. And that's really just the big picture, just understanding that we come into the world, we go out of it, and we can play as many little games as we want. As you said, you can win, you can lose, but ultimately it's not about that.
Yeah. I think Leary was his very first LSD experience. He has a kind of epiphany, and I could just read what he had to say. I think it was very short, so it kind of fits exactly what you're saying here. And this is what Leary had to say about the first time he took LSD, which I believe was in November of 61. I have never forgotten my first LSD trip, nor has it been possible for me to return to the life I was leading before that session. I've never recovered from the shattering ontological confrontation. I have never been able to take myself, my mind, and the social world as seriously. Since that time, 5 years ago, I have been acutely aware of the fact that everything I perceive, everything within and around me, is a creation of my own consciousness. So you see there in that epiphany that Leary has about LSD, it's really about the discovery that everything is a social construction, and that ultimately he can't take himself and his mind that seriously. And that's really the way he looks at the world and everything that he does. And the problem is, in the 70s, he finds himself in prison, and that's a point where, that's a very strong, it's hard to deconstruct prison and think of it just as a social construction. And I think I guess for me, that's the point where his philosophical thinking kind of breaks down when he confronts the prison experience, that he can no longer be that radical social constructionist.
Yeah, well, Leary's words there are very eloquent, but I'm also reminded of something else he refers to more than once, is that the experience ultimately is subjective. I'm talking about the waking everyday normal experience and the psychedelic experience both, that language is inadequate when it comes to trying to describe it, really. And I think that also comes up with the prison experiment, because although some of the prisoners maybe had somewhat disadvantaged backgrounds and weren't particularly literate, there was no way they were going to be able to describe what they experienced if Leary wasn't really able to do it. And there's another great phrase in all of that there's a great leveler with psychedelics, that he mentions that the prisoners could have seen what Blake, I'm assuming he's referring to William Blake, saw in his visions. And that's a great thought, the idea that we're all inherently creative, but some of these social mores and constructs have convinced some of us that we're not creative and we're just a bit useless and we can't really do anything. We all have that same potential. Yeah,
Leary was a very radically democratic thinker in the sense that he embraced that potential. And I guess, and the potential that the prisoners had, who they were inarticulate, yet they could have these visionary experiences, and that psychedelics were able to be the great leveler. But this is also what separates Leary from Aldous Huxley and the previous generation of psychedelic thinkers. Their belief was that basically we should turn on the intellectual elite of society, the writers and thinkers and scientists and musicians, but we shouldn't make too much noise about it, because if we do, we're going to create fear in the larger population. And so we need to sort of be quiet and just kind of write articles about the breakthroughs that we have, but not to make too much noise. And then Leary breaks with that tradition, and he wants to be more democratic. He wants to take them into the prisons everywhere. He wants everyone to do psychedelics. And the paradox is that what Huxley says is absolutely right, that fear takes over, and by 1966 psychedelics are made illegal, and so there is this problem with fear and prejudice and the sort of irrational reaction against psychedelics, and Leary is very optimistic when psychedelics are legal. He thinks that, in 25 years everybody will be doing them and they'll be legal, but that never happens. And so it's a kind of interesting paradox that although some people critique Huxley for being an elitist, at the same time he was right about the fear. I mean, that was the case, that you do have to kind of keep it low key in some way, that there is a sort of problem when you shout from the rooftops, that people get scared. And so it's a paradox that we haven't really been able to completely overcome, really.
Well, no doubt some of the people who called for and were perhaps involved with making these substances illegal did see potential, not for mayhem or anything like that, but for social change that maybe, I don't know, wouldn't be so profitable for them in one way or another, especially if this process was democratized. We will notice that when people do acid and mushrooms, etc., they don't generally plan wars. It tends to not enter the thinking. One of the main things about psychedelics to say is that for most people have an experience of understanding the interconnectedness of everything. That includes within our bodies, within nature, within the whole world, including human systems and natural systems, the whole lot of it. It is true that if you harm one part of it, you harm another. If you hurt someone else, you hurt yourself. It sounds kind of wishy-washy, doesn't it, and quasi-religious, but it's like something Jesus would have said. But as it turns out, it's true. What was rich about the banning crowd was that a lot of people were running about, a bit like the PMRC did later, and this woman called Mary Whitehouse, who you probably never heard of, but she was a wannabe moral guardian here in the UK. They were running around calling for things to be banned, and they'd never had anything stronger in their life than a cup of coffee. It's difficult to speak without experience. You're sort of saying, no, this is dangerous, this is damaging. It's like, what do you know about it?
Yeah. I think that Leary was very interested in social change, and he wanted to kind of clean out the culture by having them do psychedelics, and he did know that it did make you more empathetic, that it did increase your kind of interconnectedness to other people and to nature, and he knew that it also gave you a more aesthetically enhanced view of the world, and this was very much the message that he had. But ultimately, I think the people that were afraid of psychedelics, and many people who had never actually taken them, eventually they're able to dominate the discourse and get psychedelics banned, and some of the doctors who are against psychedelics never actually try them, and they don't really have any experience, and their only reference point for psychedelics, their theory is that psychedelics produce psychosis, and this is a view that is really from the 1950s, from the early 1950s. That was the original idea of LSD, was that it was going to teach us about schizophrenia, and that's what people thought in the early 50s, that it was going to provide a breakthrough for understanding that you could kind of take psychedelics and temporarily be schizophrenic, and then we were going to learn about schizophrenia. But that particular theory really becomes obsolete in about 1957-58 when the medical establishment realizes that is a very reductive way of thinking about LSD, and there's so many other things that it does as well that can't be explained with these psychotomimetic thesis. And so I guess the interesting thing about Leary in the 60s is eventually, although there's this period of intense exploration and investigation and a kind of cultural breakthroughs from 60 to 66. Eventually, the medical establishment moves back to the idea that the drugs are dangerous and that they produce psychosis, and that becomes the sort of way of thinking so it's a kind of Leary loses the kind of dialectic at that point. And the critique of psychedelics takes over again, the critique that was there in the early 50s, and then it comes back in 66. And I guess that's kind of, that explains the history of psychedelics in the 60s, is that particular dialectic, moving from the more idealistic view and the view of social change and the human potential, and then going back to that more reactionary, retrograde view that they produce psychosis and that they're damaging and so on. And that's sort of what we're left with for several decades. And then, recently there's a movement in the last 10 years to go back to psychedelics and use them in medicine and use them in therapy again. And then that's where they started, and that's where we can use them again for fighting addiction, for dealing with end-of-life anxiety. There's very interesting studies now that are looking at psychedelic as therapeutic, and that they can give us answers for certain conditions where there was no answer at all.
Well, I will say, just in closing thought, that for my money, what produces psychosis is seeing ourselves as separate from everything and everybody. If you want evidence for that, then turn on the evening news. You've touched upon where things are headed now. I mean, I don't know how much you've learned about current research when you were doing the work for your book, but I mean, it must be it was the early 90s, I think, when Dr. Rick Strassman was first doing some experiments, clinically controlled, legal experiments with people. So I wonder, would Leary be pleased at where we are now, given we're coming off such a low ebb, in the wake of his career?
I think he would be pleased. I think that he was originally interested in the licensing model, that is that psychedelics should be licensed to therapists, to psychiatrists and psychologists and spiritual guides and counselors, and that they should have access to them, and that not everybody should be able to do psychedelics in a strictly recreational sense, and that this is the early way of thinking that Leary has. Now he moves away from that in 66 when they make psychedelics illegal. But I do think that he was very serious about the idea of that you have to know what you're doing when you do psychedelics, and you need to respect them in the sense that they are that the mushrooms are sacred, and that there is a particular ritual to doing them that's very important, and that you can't just indiscriminately give them to other people who don't even know that they're taking them. Something like the acid tests of the late 60s. This idea was very, very much against what Leary was thinking in the early 60s. That the idea that of consent, that you could only give to someone, could only take psychedelics, that you couldn't sort of put psychedelics in the punch and see what happens. This is not what Leary was interested in at all.
James, today we've been discussing your book, Timothy Leary, The Harvard Years. That's available on Amazon, all the usual outlets. But before we close off for today, anything you'd like to share with listeners? Maybe you've got a website, anything that you're working on going forward?
I don't have a website. I've been thinking about getting one, but I haven't been able to put that together yet. But basically, I'm interested in people rediscovering Leary and his work, and that's why I put this book together. And I would encourage people to read his earlier work and really think about. It's very relevant to what's going on. What the initial things that Leary was interested in the early 60s are all coming back now in terms of the psychedelic studies that are being done in different universities in terms of curing addictions, curing nicotine addiction, alcoholism. Leary's very interested in this catharsis model that's being used in patient-centered therapy, psychotherapy right now, and that he was using that in the early 60s, and that by rereading his work, we have a more historical perspective, and we can learn a lot from that early period when psychedelics were still legal. And I think it helps us contextualize everything in a much more historical sense.
Excellent. Well, James, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.